I always thought some ghosts wore chains and rattled in the dark, whispering regrets and unfinished words into the ears of the living. But the ghost that came for me that night didn't haunt in whispers. He walked through the door of the diner like a storm breaking open the sky, and the moment I saw him, every piece of the life I had carefully stitched together began to come apart at the seams. It had been raining for hours, the kind of relentless rain that made the city look like it was dissolving, all its sins washing down the cracked pavement. But inside the diner, the world was small and humming, the scent of burnt coffee and grease clinging to the air, the flicker of a neon sign outside stuttering through the fogged windows, my name tag crooked against my chest. I was refilling an old man's cup when the bell above the door jingled, and I remember glancing up, just out of habit, expecting another trucker or another drunk trying to sober up before dawn. But instead I saw him. He was standing there like he had stepped out of another world, a world carved in shadow and smoke, wearing a dark suit that didn't belong anywhere near our cheap vinyl booths or the buzzing soda machine that always sputtered when it tried to pour cola. He looked older, harder, the kind of man you'd never approach on a dark street. And yet there was something in his eyes that pulled at me like a magnet, something cruelly familiar. And that's when my hands started shaking. Because no matter how much I tried to deny it, no matter how much my mind screamed that it couldn't be, that it was impossible, that he was gone, I knew those eyes. I knew them because I'd spent half my life dreaming about them, and the other half trying to forget. Lena. He said my name quietly, almost tenderly, like a word that belonged to him, and the sound of it shattered something deep inside me, because I hadn't heard that voice in 6 years. Not since the night they told me Damian Vance was dead. For a moment, everything stopped. The clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation, even the rain seemed to hold its breath. The other customers turned to look at him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dangerous in that effortless way that made people instinctively move out of his path. And then, as if the universe wanted to make sure I couldn't escape, he smiled. Not the boyish grin I remembered, but something slower, darker, like the ghost of that old smile twisted by time and sin. Damian? I whispered, the words scraping out of me like broken glass. He took a step closer, and I could smell him. Expensive cologne layered over gunpowder and rain, a scent that didn't belong to the boy I once loved, but to a man who had learned how to command the room without raising his voice. I missed that look, he murmured, eyes trailing over my face like he was memorizing it all over again. The one that says you don't know whether to run or to forgive me. My throat felt tight, my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to claw its way out. And every memory I had buried, the laughter by the lake, his hands tangled in my hair, the promises we whispered beneath a sky full of stars. They all came crashing back with violent clarity. But then another memory followed, one I couldn't drown no matter how many times I tried. The day they found his car at the bottom of the ravine. Twisted metal and shattered glass. His blood on the seats. No body recovered. I had stood there, rain pouring down, clutching the necklace he'd given me and begging the universe to be wrong. And yet here he was. Alive. Changed. Dangerous. I thought you were dead, I said, my voice trembling, my hands gripping the coffee pot like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I was, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a humorless smile. In every way that mattered. He looked around the diner, the cracked tiles, the flickering lights, the worn faces of strangers pretending not to stare. And then back at me, his eyes softening for a fleeting second before turning sharp again. You work here now? He asked, not mockingly, just curious. I wanted to tell him to leave, to walk out and never come back, to stop unraveling the fragile life I'd managed to piece together from the wreckage he left behind. but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, beneath the fear, beneath the shock, there was something else, something shameful and aching. A small, treacherous flicker of warmth that whispered, he came back. I have to get back to work, I said finally, trying to steady my voice, but he only smiled again. That slow, knowing smile that once made my knees weak and now made my stomach twist in fear. Lena, we need to talk. I don't think we do. Oh, I think we do, he said, his voice dropping low, smooth like velvet over a knife's edge. You owe me your life. I froze. What are you talking about? He leaned forward slightly, and in that moment the distance between us disappeared. His eyes caught the dim light, cold and brilliant, the kind of eyes that had seen too much, done too much. 6 years ago someone made sure I died, he said, his tone calm but burning with something darker. And the trail led back here. To you. I felt my heart stutter, 1,000 protests tangled on my tongue, but before I could speak, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the counter. A small silver locket, dented and familiar. My locket. The one that had been buried with the wreckage of his car. I found this, he said softly. Thought you'd want it back. The world tilted. My breath caught in my chest. I could barely hear over the roar of blood in my ears. He slid the locket toward me, his fingers brushing mine, cold, deliberate, electric. And in that touch, every nerve in my body screamed with confusion, with terror, with memory. I'll come back tomorrow, he said, straightening, buttoning his jacket with slow precision. We'll finish this conversation then. And just like that, he turned and walked out, his figure swallowed by the rain-soaked night, the door closing behind him with a soft chime that felt far too gentle for the destruction he'd left behind. I stood there, staring at the locket glinting under the cheap fluorescent light, and all I could think was that the past I had buried had just clawed its way out of the grave. The rain outside kept falling, harder now, almost furious, and somewhere deep in my chest I knew. This was only the beginning. Because Damien Vance wasn't the boy I loved anymore. He was something else. And whatever he wanted from me, it wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more dangerous. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I just lay there on the thin mattress of my one-room apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling that looked like a map of all the wrong turns my life had taken, listening to the rain as it turned from a steady rhythm into an angry storm that rattled the window pane and reminded me that nothing stays quiet forever, especially the past. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Damien Vance, alive and standing in the doorway of the diner, as if death had merely been a detour for him, as if the universe had made some kind of mistake by letting me believe he was gone. His voice still lingered in my mind, low and calm and impossibly controlled, saying my name like it belonged to him, like he could still reach into the wreckage of what we once were and pull me back into it. I told myself it wasn't real, that maybe I had imagined him, that trauma does strange things to memory and sometimes grief comes dressed as hallucination. But the locket sitting on my kitchen table said otherwise, gleaming faintly in the weak morning light, heavy with everything I didn't want to remember. I'd left it there after closing the diner, untouched, because even looking at it felt like touching a ghost, like pressing my fingers to a wound that had never really healed. By the time the sun clawed its way through the clouds, my eyes were burning, my chest tight, and I had made a silent promise to myself that if he came back, if Damien truly was alive and had found me again after all these years, I would demand answers. Not as the girl who once loved him, but as the woman who had survived without him. But the truth was, I didn't feel strong. I felt like a candle in a hurricane, flickering and terrified of what the wind would do next. The diner looked different that day. Maybe because I did. Maybe because I was seeing everything through a lens cracked by fear and memory. The bell above the door seemed louder, the customers' chatter too sharp, the smell of coffee almost suffocating. I kept expecting him to walk in again, half dreading it, half craving it, and when the door finally opened and he did, it was as if the world itself held its breath just to watch what would happen next. He wasn't wearing the same suit. This one was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, a thin black tie knotted precisely at his throat. And as he stepped inside, the conversations around us faltered. The waitress beside me froze mid-step, and even the jukebox seemed to hesitate before playing the next song. It wasn't just the way he looked. It was the air that shifted around him, thick with authority and danger, like the atmosphere bowed to him out of instinct. When our eyes met, I felt the same jolt I had felt the night before, a violent collision of recognition and disbelief, and something darker, something magnetic that I hated myself for feeling. He gave me that small, restrained smile again, the one that looked like a secret no one else could ever be trusted with, and walked straight toward the counter. "Good morning, Lena," he said, his tone casual, almost gentle, though his presence made everyone else in the diner shrink into their seats. "You look tired." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze even though it felt like staring into the edge of a blade. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough to make me proud. He leaned against the counter, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface, eyes scanning my face as though he could still read every thought I tried to hide. "You always did hate surprises," he said softly, and for a moment I saw it. The boy I'd known, the one who used to skip stones across the lake and talk about getting out of this miserable town. But then it was gone, replaced by a calm, calculating expression that belonged to a man who had outgrown the concept of mercy. "Why are you here, Damien?" I asked finally, trying to ignore the way his name still felt dangerous on my tongue. He tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was a riddle he had all the time in the world to solve. "I told you last night," he said. "You owe me." "I don't owe you anything," I said, though my voice cracked halfway through, betraying me. "You disappeared. You died." His eyes darkened, a storm gathering behind them. "I didn't disappear," he said quietly. "I was buried alive in someone else's war." The words hung between us, heavy and electric, and though I wanted to demand an explanation, I could see the warning in his eyes. Not now, not here. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the counter toward me. "What is this?" I asked, hesitating before touching it. "Proof," he said, "that your father isn't the man you think he is." I froze. The room seemed to tilt, the sounds fading around me until all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. My father had been gone for years, long before Damien, long before everything fell apart. And though I hadn't seen him in forever, I refused to believe that the man who once worked double shifts just to put food on the table could ever have been involved in anything that would destroy someone's life. "You're lying," I said, my hands trembling. "Am I?" He straightened, buttoning his suit jacket with slow precision. "Your father made a deal with men who wanted me dead. He sold information to them, information that got my family killed. You might want to believe he was innocent, Lena. But the world we grew up in doesn't forgive that kind of betrayal." His words hit like a fist, each syllable another fracture in the fragile image I had held on to for so long. "That's not possible," I whispered. "My father, he wasn't like that." Damien's voice softened, though his eyes didn't. "People become things you never expect when survival's on the line. You of all people should understand that." I didn't know what hurt more, the accusation or the quiet truth buried in his tone, the suggestion that we were both products of our broken pasts. Before I could respond, a man walked in. Tall, muscular, wearing a dark coat, a faint scar across his jaw, and nodded subtly toward Damien. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, the kind that comes from years of silent orders and obedience. Damien looked at him, then back at me. "I have to go," he said, his voice soft but final. "But I'll be seeing you again." "I don't want you to." He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "It's not about what you want anymore, Lena. It's about what you owe." And before I could say another word, he turned and walked out, his men following, the door swinging shut behind them with a sound that felt like the end of something I couldn't name. I stood there, shaking, the folded paper still on the counter, the air around me thick with the weight of everything he had just said. For a long time I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the echo of his words. When I finally unfolded the paper, my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't just proof. It was a photograph. Grainy, old, but clear enough to recognize the man standing beside Damien's father in a warehouse surrounded by men in suits, the kind of men who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. My father. Alive. And standing beside criminals. I dropped the photo, my pulse roaring in my ears, the ground tilting beneath me. Because if that picture was real, then everything I thought I knew about my family, about Damien, about the past, was a lie. And if Damien had found me now, after all these years, it wasn't to forgive me. It was to make me pay. The next few days passed in that strange, disjointed way that time moves when you're afraid to touch it, when every hour feels like borrowed glass. You're terrified might shatter beneath your fingertips, when every sound becomes a whisper of something watching, waiting, closing in. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe the photograph was a fake, that Damien was lying or manipulating me for reasons that only made sense in the twisted world he now lived in. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more that single image of my father standing beside those men began to eat at me like rot beneath my skin. I stopped sleeping again. Every night I'd stare at the ceiling and remember the last time I saw my father. His hands trembling as he packed a small suitcase, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice rough when he told me he had to leave for a while, that he'd send money, that I'd be fine. I was 17 then, angry and heartbroken, and too young to understand that love and desperation sometimes look the same when life starts cornering you. I never saw him again. I'd spent years convincing myself he was a good man, that whatever happened to him wasn't his fault, that the world just swallowed him whole like it did to everyone who didn't have the power to fight back. But now, Damien's words haunted every corner of that fragile belief. By the third night, I could barely stand it. I went to work. I smiled for customers. I poured coffee until my hands ached. But inside I was unraveling. A quiet, steady unspooling of sanity. And then, just when I thought maybe I had imagined it all, that maybe he had finally decided to leave me alone, he came back. It was just after closing. The neon sign outside buzzed weakly, casting the diner in a sickly red glow, and I was wiping down the counter when the door opened, the small bell chiming softly like it didn't know it was announcing something terrible. Damien stepped inside, alone this time. No guards, no shadows trailing him, just the storm that always seemed to follow wherever he went. His presence filled the room instantly, the same way it always had, as if the air itself bowed to make space for him. "Lena," he said quietly, almost like a greeting, almost like a warning. I didn't move. I just kept wiping the counter, pretending that if I stayed still long enough, maybe he'd dissolve like smoke. "We're closed," I said finally, not looking up. "I'm not here for coffee," he replied, and there was something in his voice that made my fingers tighten around the rag until my knuckles went white. I forced myself to meet his gaze, and for a moment I wished I hadn't, because his eyes were colder tonight, the color of deep winter, and though his face was calm, there was a quiet violence in the way he stood there, like a man trying to cage his own fury. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He stepped closer, his shoes silent against the floor. His scent a mix of rain and smoke and something sharper. Danger, maybe, or regret. "I told you," he said, his tone measured. "You owe me." I laughed then, bitter and hollow. "For what? For being stupid enough to love you once?" Something flickered across his face, a shadow, a memory. But it vanished quickly, replaced by that same icy composure. "For the debt your father left behind," he said simply. My stomach twisted. "You think I know anything about that?" "I think you know more than you realize," he said, taking another step forward until he was close enough for me to see the faint scar that cut across his jawline. Something I hadn't noticed before. Something that spoke of pain and violence and years spent surviving things I couldn't imagine. "And even if you don't," he continued softly, "you'll learn." "I'm not part of this," I whispered, shaking my head, the rag falling from my hand. "Whatever happened between you and him, that has nothing to do with me." He reached out suddenly, his hand catching my wrist before I could move away. His grip firm but not cruel, his thumb pressing against my pulse like he was measuring how afraid I was. Or maybe how alive. "Everything has to do with you," he said, his voice low, dangerous in its calmness. "You're the only thing he cared about. The only thing he begged them to spare." The words hit like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father made a deal that cost me everything," Damien said, his gaze burning into mine. "And when it all fell apart, when they came for me, he tried to save you instead. He traded my life for yours." I pulled my hand back, stumbling a step away, shaking my head as if that could make the words untrue. No, that's not possible." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that for one brief heartbeat made him look human again. "I wish it wasn't," he said quietly. "But it's done. And now." He looked up, his expression hardening again, his voice turning colder. "Now the debt is yours." The silence that followed was so heavy I thought I might drown in it. I didn't understand what he meant, not fully, but I knew enough to feel the terror crawling up my throat. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something from his coat, a small black envelope, and placed it on the counter. "Pack a bag," he said finally. "You're coming with me." My breath caught. "The hell I am." He tilted his head slightly, almost pitying. "You don't have a choice, Lena." "Yes, I do," I snapped, but the words felt fragile even as I said them. "You can't just—" "Can't I?" he interrupted softly, and there was something in his tone that made the world tilt, something final and absolute. "You think I came here by accident? You think I don't know where you live, where you work, what little you have left? If I wanted to, I could destroy it all before morning. But I don't want that. I just want what I'm owed." I stared at him, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "And what exactly is that?" He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You." The word was soft, but it hit like a gunshot, echoing in the hollow space between us. For a long time, neither of us moved. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the faint buzz of the dying neon sign outside. Finally, I found my voice. "You're insane." "Maybe," he said, straightening, his expression unreadable. "But I'm also right." Before I could react, before I could even think of what to say, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. I heard movement, the faint rustle of fabric, and then his voice again, calm and close, Too close. You can fight me if you want, he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. But the moment you step outside that door, you'll understand that you're already in my world, whether you like it or not. And then the lights came back on, harsh and blinding, and he was gone. The door swinging slightly, the night swallowing him whole once again. On the counter, the black envelope remained, my name written across it in his familiar, precise handwriting. My hands shook as I reached for it, tearing it open, and inside was a single plane ticket, one way, to New York. Below it, a note written in the same elegant script. You can run, but I'll still find you. The debt must be paid. I sank to the floor then, the weight of it all crashing over me like a tidal wave I had been too naive to see coming. Because I understood now, whatever Damien Vance wanted, whatever darkness he had dragged himself out of, I was part of it. And this time, there would be no running. I don't remember the exact moment I stopped resisting and started surrendering, but I think it happened somewhere between fear and exhaustion, somewhere in that fragile space where the body gives up before the heart does, because I told myself I would never go with him, that I would never step willingly into the darkness he called home. And yet 2 nights later, I found myself sitting in the back seat of a sleek black car that smelled faintly of leather and danger, the city lights stretching behind us like a map of every mistake I'd ever made. The plane ticket he had left for me burned in my mind like a brand, a silent command that I wanted so desperately to ignore. But when I came home from work that evening and found my apartment door unlocked, the air inside heavy with the scent of cologne and smoke, I knew the choice had already been made for me. There on the table, where the locket once lay, was a single white rose wrapped in a black ribbon, and beneath it a note written in his elegant, precise hand. If you make me come for you, I won't be gentle. So I packed a bag. Not because I wasn't afraid. I was terrified. But because something inside me knew that whatever this was, whatever he wanted from me, running wouldn't save me. He had found me once. He would find me again. And deep down, in that small, shameful corner of my soul that still remembered the warmth of his touch and the sound of his laugh, I needed to see what he had become. The car drove through the night in silence, the driver expressionless behind dark glasses, and I sat there staring out the window, my reflection faint and ghostly against the city blur, wondering how a girl who once dreamed of escape had ended up trapped in the orbit of a man who made freedom look like a fairy tale. When the car finally stopped, the world outside had changed. The noise of the city replaced by the low hum of cicadas and the rustle of trees. Before us stood a mansion so large it didn't seem real. A sprawling fortress of stone and glass, surrounded by iron gates and shadows that seemed to breathe. It was beautiful in a cold, intimidating way. Too perfect, too controlled, like everything inside was meant to look untouchable. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out slowly, clutching the strap of my bag as if it were a lifeline. The air smelled like rain and polished steel. The front doors opened before I could even reach them, and there he was. Damien Vance, standing at the top of the stairs, his silhouette framed by the golden light behind him, his presence so commanding it made the night itself seem to bow. "You came," he said, his tone unreadable, and though I wanted to say something sharp, something defiant, all I could manage was a hollow trembling. Did I really have a choice? He descended the steps slowly, each movement measured, deliberate, like a predator that knew the prey wasn't going anywhere. "Everyone has a choice," he said softly, stopping just in front of me, his eyes searching mine. "But most people make the wrong one." The words hung between us, sharp as glass. He reached out then, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and I flinched, not because his touch was rough, but because it was too gentle, too familiar, and I hated that part of me still leaned toward it like a moth toward flame. "Come inside," he murmured, his voice low and coaxing, the same voice that once whispered love against my skin, and now carried the weight of something far more dangerous. Inside, the mansion was a world of polished marble, soft lights, and quiet menace. Everything gleamed, the floors, the furniture, even the silence, and yet it felt cold, like a museum built to worship power instead of beauty. I followed him through hallways lined with paintings of storms and oceans and men who looked like they'd never known mercy. The air was thick with the scent of expensive whiskey and something metallic I couldn't name. "Why am I here?" I asked finally, my voice echoing slightly against the walls. He didn't turn around. "Because you need to understand the world your father touched," he said, "and because you need to understand me." "I don't want to understand you. I snapped, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He turned then, his eyes dark, but not angry, almost amused. "You say that," he said, "but you wouldn't be here if it were true." He wasn't wrong, and that realization made me hate myself a little more. He led me into a room that looked more like a study than a living space. Shelves lined with books, a decanter of amber liquid on a glass table, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a garden that seemed to exist only to remind the night how quiet it could be. "This will be your room," he said simply, and I blinked, confused. "My room?" "For now," he said, "until I decide what to do with you." The calm way he said it sent a chill through me, as if my fate were something he could rearrange at will, like furniture. "I'm not a thing you can keep," I whispered. He smiled faintly. "You always were too proud for your own good." He poured himself a drink, the sound of the liquid against glass oddly intimate. "You're here because of choices your father made, but how long you stay, how much you lose, that's up to you." I stared at him, the memories of the boy he used to be clashing violently with the man before me. Once upon a time he had been warmth and laughter, and dreams of leaving this broken town together. Now he was ice-wrapped in silk, danger disguised as elegance. "What happened to you?" I asked softly. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said, "I died." He set his drink down and stepped closer. So close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the pulse in his throat. "The night they betrayed me, I lost everything. My father, my future, my name. I spent years clawing my way out of that grave, learning what power costs, learning that love makes you weak. And when I finally came back, I found that the only person who ever mattered was part of the lie." His words sank into me like poison, slow and burning. "You think I lied to you?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I think you didn't know how deep the lies went," he said quietly. "But ignorance doesn't erase debt." He reached out then, his fingers brushing against the side of my face, and though I should have pulled away, I didn't. His touch was soft, but it felt like a test, like a reminder of how easily he could ruin me if he wanted to. "You're shaking," he murmured, his thumb tracing my jaw. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied. He smiled again, that same slow, devastating smile that made it impossible to tell whether he wanted to kiss me or destroy me. "You should be." The silence that followed was unbearable, filled with everything we weren't saying, everything we used to be. Finally, he stepped back, his face hardening again, the softness gone. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we start digging up the truth." When he left the room, the air felt colder, emptier, like he had taken all the warmth with him. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlight spilling through the window, my heart a mess of contradictions. Fear and longing, hate and nostalgia, love and something darker that I didn't have a name for. Because the truth was simple and terrible and impossible to escape. I still loved him. Not the man he had become, maybe, but the echo of who he used to be. the boy who promised forever and kept only his absence. And as the night deepened around me, I realized that for all his threats and all his cruelty, the real danger wasn't him. It was me, and the way I couldn't stop wanting him. There are moments in life that stretch so thin, you can almost see time tearing at the edges. Moments where you feel suspended between what you were and what you are about to become. And for me, that moment began the second the car door shut behind me, and the city lights disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by a night that felt too quiet, too endless, too deliberate, as if even the stars knew to keep their distance from Damien Vance. The car hummed softly, moving through the dark with the precision of a blade, and I sat in the back seat, my hands clenched in my lap, my heart pounding with a rhythm that didn't feel entirely my own, because it was hard to believe that only days ago I had been living a small, tired life, filled with cheap coffee, flickering neon lights, and the dull ache of forgetting. And now I was being driven into the unknown by the man who had once been my first love, and who now carried himself with the silence and certainty of someone who had walked hand in hand with violence for far too long. He didn't speak for most of the drive, and neither did I, though there were 1,000 words trapped between us, unsaid and unfinished, each one sharp enough to draw blood if I dared to give it shape. I watched the road ahead, the faint reflection of the dashboard lights glinting off his face, carving his features into angles I didn't recognize. Older, colder, beautiful in that dangerous, unreachable way that made me wonder if the boy I'd loved had been a dream I'd once mistaken for reality. When we finally turned off the main road and the tires crunched against gravel, I looked up and saw it. His house. Or maybe I should say his empire. Because that's what it looked like. A fortress built for a man who trusted no one. The mansion rose out of the darkness like something carved from stone and shadow, its tall windows glowing faintly in the distance, the gates opening before us without a sound. And for a moment I felt like I was being pulled into another world. His world. One where money and power and danger all bled into one another until they were impossible to separate. The car stopped in front of wide marble steps, and the driver got out to open my door, but my legs wouldn't move right away. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the grand facade that loomed over me, the kind of place you might see in a movie, beautiful and terrifying all at once. When I finally stepped out, the air felt heavier, scented faintly with rain and expensive cologne, and somewhere deep inside me, a voice whispered that once I crossed that threshold, there would be no going back. He was waiting for me at the top of the steps, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm, almost unreadable, though I could sense the tension beneath it. The kind that coils around a person who's spent years pretending they don't feel anything. "You came," he said, his tone quiet but weighted, as if the words meant more than he wanted to admit. I wanted to tell him I hadn't had a choice, that fear had done what love could not, but instead I said nothing. I just looked at him, and for one impossible second, I saw a flash of the boy I used to know. The boy who would sneak through my bedroom window at midnight, smelling like smoke and rain, who once promised he'd build me a life big enough for both of us. But that boy had been buried 6 years ago, and the man standing before me was what had crawled out of his grave. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to follow, and as I walked past him, the faintest brush of his arm against mine sent a tremor through me that I tried, and failed, to hide. Inside, the air was cool and still, filled with the quiet hum of power. The floors gleamed beneath my shoes, marble and polished wood reflecting light from chandeliers that hung like captured constellations. Everything smelled of wealth and danger, a strange, intoxicating mix of tobacco, leather, and something darker, metallic, like the memory of blood. "Do you live here alone?" I asked finally, my voice breaking the silence like glass. He glanced at me. a small, unreadable smile tugging at his lips. "Does it look like the kind of place built for company?" I didn't answer, because he was right. The house felt too empty, too deliberate, like every trace of humanity had been carefully stripped away. He led me down a hallway lined with portraits of men whose eyes followed me no matter where I turned, all of them with the same expression: pride, arrogance, hunger. At the end of the hall was a set of double doors that opened into a room that took my breath away. Books lined every wall, hundreds of them, old and beautiful, their spines gleaming in the low amber light. A fire burned in the massive hearth, its glow soft and restless, and in front of it sat a black leather sofa, a table with crystal glasses, a decanter of whiskey half empty. "Sit," he said, motioning toward the sofa. And though I wanted to argue, to say I wasn't some obedient thing he could order around, I sat anyway. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine just enough to remind me how easily he could undo me if he wanted to. I took a sip, the burn sliding down my throat, and tried not to meet his eyes. "You hate me right now," he said, suddenly, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "But hate is good. Hate means you still care enough to feel something." I looked up sharply. "You think this is about feelings? You kidnapped me, Damien." He laughed softly, a sound both cruel and sad. "Kidnapped is such an ugly word. You're not a prisoner, Lena. You're collateral." The word made my skin crawl. "Collateral for what?" "For the truth," he said simply, setting his glass down. "Your father's choices cost me everything, and before this is over, you're going to understand exactly what that means." I wanted to scream, to tell him that my father's sins weren't mine to atone for, but the look in his eyes silenced me. That cold, disciplined calm that came from a man who had learned the art of control too well. "Why do I get the feeling you don't want me to understand?" I said quietly. He smiled faintly, stepping closer until he was standing just in front of me, his shadow cutting across my knees. "Because once you do," he murmured, "you'll never look at me the same way again." The air between us felt electric, heavy, charged with the kind of tension that comes from shared history and unfinished hunger. He reached down, his fingers tracing the edge of my jaw, not roughly but with a deliberate intimacy that made it impossible to breathe. "You're shaking," he said, his tone unreadable. "I'm angry," I whispered. "Anger and fear are cousins," he said, his thumb brushing the corner of my mouth. "You always wore both so beautifully." "Stop," I breathed, my voice trembling. He hesitated, and for a heartbeat I thought he might listen, but instead he leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "You shouldn't have come here if you wanted safety, Lena. There's no safety left in this story. Not for you, not for me." And then he stepped back, his expression unreadable again, the softness gone as quickly as it came. "Get some rest," he said, turning away. "You'll need it." When he left the room, the silence he left behind was unbearable. I sat there for a long time, staring at the flames, my pulse still racing, the taste of whiskey and fear still on my tongue. It was only then that I realized what terrified me most wasn't the mansion, or the lies, or even Damien himself. It was the part of me that still wanted to reach for him, even knowing he was the one who could destroy me. Because I had loved him once. Truly, foolishly, completely. And I didn't know how to stop loving him now. Not when the monster he'd become still carried the echo of the boy I used to know. And as the fire burned low, casting the room in soft, dangerous light, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't afraid of the monster in front of me. I was afraid of the girl who still loved him. The first few days in Damien's house moved like a fever dream, the kind that leaves you half awake and unsure if you're still trapped inside it, because everything felt too large, too still, too rich with the scent of danger and memory. And though the rooms were filled with light, I could never find a corner that felt warm. The walls seemed to listen, the air too quiet to be trusted, and every footstep echoed like a reminder that I didn't belong there, that I was not a guest but a possession being catalogued, studied, and kept under lock and key. Damien was rarely home during the day, and when he was, his presence filled the house in ways that made it impossible to breathe. I'd hear the low rumble of his voice in the study, commanding men I never saw but always sensed, their shadows moving behind closed doors. Sometimes, I'd catch pieces of their conversation, words like shipment, Rossetti, territory, words that told me his world ran on violence and control, that every moment he was out there, he was gambling his life for power. At night, I'd hear the sound of cars pulling into the driveway, engines cutting off, doors slamming, voices low and sharp. Then silence again. Always silence. I told myself to stay out of it, to keep my head down, to wait for the moment I could slip away. But I'd never been good at obedience. Not with him. Not even when I should have been. And one evening, when I heard shouting from downstairs, harsh, angry voices, the sound of something breaking, I couldn't stop myself. I left my room and followed the noise, barefoot on the cold marble floor, the pulse in my throat so loud it drowned out everything else. The shouting came from the main hall, and when I reached the edge of the staircase, I saw him. Damien, standing at the base of the steps, his face calm in that way that made the calm itself more terrifying. 3 men stood across from him, their suits expensive but rumpled, their eyes wild with anger and fear. One of them was bleeding from the lip. "You think you can take what's mine?" Damien's voice was low, but it carried through the hall like a blade. The tallest man spat blood onto the floor. "You don't own this city, Vance. The Rossettis don't bow to anyone." The name made something in my chest tighten. I remembered hearing it before, whispered through the thin walls of the diner, always spoken in fear. Damien smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that promised something worse than death. "You already did," he said softly. "You just didn't notice when you started kneeling." The man lunged forward, but Damien moved faster, impossibly fast, slamming him against the marble pillar with one hand at his throat. His voice dropped to a whisper I barely heard. "Next time you come to my house, you don't walk out." The other 2 men froze, and I stood there on the stairs, unable to move, unable to breathe. The man choked, gasped, clawed at Damien's wrist, but Damien didn't flinch, didn't even blink, until finally he let go, letting the man fall to his knees, coughing and broken. "Get out!" Damien said, and his tone was so cold, so final, that the other men didn't hesitate. They dragged their injured companion out the door, leaving the sound of heavy breathing and shattered glass behind them. When they were gone, he turned toward the stairs, toward me, and for a second I thought I might be invisible, that he hadn't seen me. But then his eyes met mine, sharp and unrelenting, and my heart stopped. "Did I tell you to leave your room?" he asked quietly, each word a measured threat. "I heard shouting," I said, gripping the banister to keep my hands from shaking. "I thought—" "You thought what?" he interrupted, his gaze burning into me as he started up the stairs, slow, deliberate, every step echoing. "That I needed your help? That I couldn't handle 3 pathetic men in suits?" "No," I said quickly, my voice catching. "I just—" He reached the top of the stairs before I could finish. His hand caught the railing beside my head, caging me in without touching me, his proximity almost unbearable. "You don't understand what kind of men you're dealing with," he said softly. "If they knew who you were, if they even suspected what you mean to me, they wouldn't stop until they had you." "What I mean to you?" I echoed, my breath shallow, my pulse wild. "What do I mean to you, Damien? Am I leverage? A ghost? A memory you couldn't bury? His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking down to my mouth before he stepped back, as if he'd caught himself crossing a line he didn't trust himself to stop at. "You're none of those things," he said, though his voice didn't sound certain. "You're a liability, and I protect what's mine." "I'm not yours," I whispered, but even as I said it, I could feel the lie trembling in my throat. He smiled faintly, not out of humor, but something closer to pain. "You've been mine since the moment you said my name like it meant something," he murmured, and then he walked away, leaving me standing there with a heart that didn't know whether to break or burn. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of wind against glass. Somewhere deep in the mansion, I could hear Damien's voice again, lower this time, speaking into a phone. I caught fragments of words. Rossetti's, retaliation, keep her safe. And though I didn't understand all of it, I understood enough to know that whatever was coming next was bigger than me, bigger than him. When morning came, the air felt different, heavy, tense, charged like the moment before a storm. Damien was gone, but his men were everywhere now, armed and silent, stationed like shadows at every doorway. I asked one of them what was happening, but he said nothing, only shook his head once and looked away. By afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I went outside, hoping for air, for space. But as I stepped into the garden, I realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. And then I heard it. The faint click of metal, the whisper of danger. Before I could react, Damien was there, pulling me backward, his arm around my waist, his other hand drawing the gun from his jacket in one fluid motion. The shot came a second later, splintering the marble column inches from where my head had been. I screamed, the sound tearing through the silence, and he shoved me behind him, his body tense, his voice low and lethal. "Stay down." 2 more shots rang out, then silence again, broken only by the sound of someone running. Damien moved like something out of a nightmare. Fast, precise, a predator who had been waiting for this moment. When it was over, one of his men emerged from the trees, dragging a stranger by the collar, bloodied, unconscious, dressed in black. "Rossetti," Damien said, his voice calm, almost coldly satisfied. I was shaking, my hands pressed against the ground, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear. When he turned to me, his expression softened just slightly, enough to remind me that somewhere beneath the violence and the power, there was still something human left, though I didn't know if that made him more dangerous or less. He knelt beside me, his hand brushing against my cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. I shook my head, unable to speak. "Good," he said, his tone darkening, "because if you were, I'd burn this city down." The words sent a shiver through me. Not just fear, but something else. Something reckless and alive that I didn't want to name. Because in that moment, surrounded by the scent of smoke and gunpowder, I realized the truth I'd been trying to deny since the day he walked back into my life. He was both my ruin and my refuge, and I was already too far gone to turn back. It's strange how quickly you can become accustomed to fear, how it seeps into your bones and reshapes itself into a kind of rhythm, a quiet background noise you start to mistake for safety. And maybe that's why I didn't run after the attack. Maybe that's why I stayed, because the terror had turned into something else, something I couldn't name, a feeling that lived somewhere between fascination and ruin, a slow acceptance that my life now existed in the orbit of a man who held both salvation and damnation in his hands and didn't seem to know the difference anymore. After the night in the garden, Damien changed. Or maybe he simply stopped pretending. The sharp edges of his world began to cut through the polished veneer of control. Men with guns patrolling the grounds, Cars coming and going at all hours, whispered conversations that ended the moment I walked into a room. There was tension in the air now, a heaviness that felt like thunder before a storm. And though he tried to shield me from it, I could see it in the set of his jaw, the restless pacing of his movements, the way his eyes never seemed to rest. He didn't sleep much, and when he did, it was shallow, haunted. I'd hear him walking the halls late at night, his footsteps slow, deliberate, echoing against marble like the steps of a man who knew peace would never come for him. Sometimes I'd find him standing in the study, shirt unbuttoned, drink in hand, staring at the fire as if it were the only thing that could keep his ghosts at bay. Once I asked him what he was thinking about, and he looked at me with a kind of hollow amusement before saying, "How many men I've killed to keep this life." He said it so calmly, so quietly, that for a moment it didn't even sound like confession. It sounded like math. I wanted to ask if he regretted it, if there was still a piece of his soul left beneath the scars and the blood. But the truth sat on my tongue like a stone I couldn't swallow, because the man who once held me under a blanket of stars was now the man who could end a life without blinking. And I didn't know which version of him frightened me more, the monster who acted without mercy, or the broken boy who still carried the memory of love in his eyes. Days blurred together. I learned not to ask questions, not to linger too long in rooms where decisions were made. But one evening, curiosity won over caution. The sound of raised voices drew me toward the west wing. Voices I didn't recognize, low and tense. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and when I peered inside, I saw Damien with 3 of his men, one of whom was holding another man by the collar. Beaten, bloodied, terrified. He was feeding information to the Rossettis, one of Damien's men said. "We caught him trying to pass along your shipment routes." The beaten man, barely more than a boy, really, shook his head weakly. "Please, Mr. Vance, I didn't mean to. They threatened my family. I had no choice." Damien's expression didn't change. He didn't shout. He didn't even move. He just stared at the man like he was studying a stain he couldn't quite remove. "You always have a choice," he said softly, almost kindly. "You just made the wrong one." The man started to cry then, babbling apologies, promising he'd disappear, that he'd never breathe a word again. And I wanted to believe Damien would show mercy, that the man I had once known was still buried somewhere beneath the suit and the scars. But before I could even blink, Damien drew his gun, and the sound that followed was sharp, final, merciless. The man collapsed, and the silence that filled the room afterward was suffocating. I stumbled back, a hand pressed to my mouth, the metallic scent of blood already thick in the air, and before I could move, Damien turned, his eyes finding me in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Lena," he said quietly, lowering the gun. I wanted to speak, to scream, to ask, why? But my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't look away from the body on the floor, the blood spreading slowly like spilled wine across the expensive rug. He took a step toward me and I flinched, which made something in his expression flicker. Pain, maybe, or regret. I couldn't tell. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "You killed him," I managed, my voice breaking. "He was begging for his life." "He betrayed me," Damien said simply. "If I let one man defy me, the rest follow. That's how this world works, Lena. You survive or you're devoured." "That's not survival," I said, my hands shaking. "That's blood on your hands." He looked down at them then, those strong, elegant hands that had once held mine with such gentleness, and for a heartbeat, his composure cracked. "You think I don't know that?" he whispered. "You think I don't see their faces every night when I close my eyes? This isn't who I wanted to become, but this is who I had to be." Something in his voice, the rawness of it, the quiet confession buried under the steel, made my chest ache even as my stomach turned. Because the truth I didn't want to face was that part of me still saw the boy beneath the monster, still wanted to reach for him even as I stood trembling in front of what he'd done. "I loved you once," I said, my voice barely audible, "and I don't even know who you are anymore." He stepped closer, his gaze burning with something desperate, something unguarded. "You loved me because you saw the good in me," he said, his words quick, rough. "Don't pretend you can't still see it. It's still there even if you hate it now." "I don't hate it," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I hate that it's dying." He froze, the air between us tightening, and for a long, fragile moment, the world shrank to the space of a breath. Then slowly he reached out and touched my face, his thumb brushing a tear from my cheek. And when I didn't pull away, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here, Lena. You make me remember who I was, and that's dangerous for both of us." I should have told him to let me go, to leave me out of his war, but I couldn't, because there was something in his voice that sounded like surrender, like he was confessing to a crime even he couldn't undo. He left me standing there as his men came in to drag the body away, and I turned before they could look at me, running down the hall, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I locked myself in my room and sank to the floor, my whole body trembling, my mind replaying the moment again and again. The gunshot, the blood, the way his eyes had gone cold. But beneath the horror, beneath the fear, something else was burning. A terrible, shameful understanding. Because I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, and I couldn't unfeel what I felt. He had killed without hesitation. And still, part of me wanted to reach for him. It was madness. It was weakness. It was everything I swore I'd never be. I pressed my hands over my face, trying to block out the image, but all I could see was him. Damien, standing in the firelight, the weight of his sins etched into the hard lines of his face. Blood on his hands, love in his voice, damnation in his eyes, and as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew this truth would follow me forever. That the man I once loved had become the thing I should fear most. And yet he was still the only one who could make me feel alive. There are moments when life fractures so completely that the pieces no longer fit together, no matter how desperately you try to press them back into place. Moments when you realize that the line between love and fear, between loyalty and captivity, has blurred so thoroughly that it no longer matters which side of it you stand on, because either way you are bound. And that is what I had become in Damien's world. Bound, not by chains or locked doors, but by something far more dangerous. The pull of a man who could destroy me and yet kept saving me just enough to make me stay. After that night in the study, the one where I saw what he was truly capable of, something inside me changed. I told myself I hated him, that what he did disgusted me, that the blood on his hands would forever stain whatever we once had. But hatred, I realized, is not the opposite of love. It is its mirror, distorted and raw. And every time he walked into the room, I felt that same terrible mixture of fury and longing claw its way through my chest until it hurt just to breathe. The house was different now, louder in some ways, and yet eerily still, filled with the distant hum of danger. Men came and went like shadows, their eyes always avoiding mine, their conversations hushed but urgent. I caught words like Rossetti retaliation, shipment hit, and traitor, and though no one explained anything to me, I didn't need to be told that Damien was at war again, not just with the world outside, but with the ghosts he'd buried beneath his empire. He was gone most nights, and when he returned, it was always the same. The smell of smoke and gunpowder clinging to his clothes, the cut across his knuckles not yet healed, the silence that wrapped around him like a second skin. He never told me where he went, and I never asked. But I could see the toll it took. The sleepless eyes, The low growl in his voice when someone spoke out of turn, the exhaustion that came from carrying too much power and not enough peace. And yet, for all his distance, he still kept me close. His men had orders. No one was to touch me. No one was to question my presence. And that kind of protection felt like both a cage and a confession. I wanted to believe it meant he cared, that somewhere beneath all that rage and vengeance there was still a heart that remembered me. But I had learned enough about men like Damien to know that possession often wears the same face as love. It was 2 weeks after the killing when everything began to unravel again. I woke to the sound of raised voices echoing from downstairs. Sharp, tense, filled with the kind of fury that comes from betrayal. I wrapped myself in a silk robe and followed the noise, my bare feet silent on the marble floor. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I saw Damien standing in the middle of the hall, his expression carved from stone, facing a man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, eyes darting like a cornered animal. "You sold me out," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of quiet that came before violence. "You fed information to the Rossettis and now my men are dead." The man shook his head, his hands trembling. "It wasn't me. I swear it wasn't me." I saw the flicker of movement before I heard the sound. Damien's hand striking the man hard enough to send him stumbling backward, blood blooming on his lip. "Don't lie to me," he said softly. "You're not good at it." "Damien," I said without meaning to, my voice breaking the spell, and for a moment everything stopped. The air, the sound, even the man's ragged breathing. Damien turned toward me slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable, and for a second I thought I saw something almost fragile there, something that looked like the boy I once knew. But it vanished the moment he spoke. "Go back upstairs, Lena," he said, his tone even but absolute. "I'm not leaving," I said, though my voice shook. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening. You can't keep doing this." He exhaled, a sound half laugh, half sigh, the kind that comes from someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be understood. "You think this is a choice?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think I want any of this? You have no idea what it costs to keep power, what it costs to stay alive." "I don't care about power," I said. "I care about what's left of you." For a heartbeat, the world held still. His eyes softened, just a fraction, and he took a step toward me. One slow, deliberate step, like he was crossing some invisible line. "If I let go of what I've built," he said quietly, "they'll kill us both. You understand that, don't you?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that his cruelty was survival, that his darkness was protection. But the blood on his hands was too fresh, the fear too real. "Then why keep me here?" I whispered. "Why drag me into this?" He looked at me like I'd asked the one question he didn't know how to answer. "Because I can't lose you again," he said finally, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. "Because you're the only thing left that makes me remember I'm still human." The silence that followed was thick, trembling with things neither of us could say. And then, before I could step back, he closed the distance between us and kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was the kind of kiss that feels like an argument, desperate and angry and laced with grief, his hand tangled in my hair, his breath ragged against my skin. For a moment I forgot everything. The blood, the fear, the danger. For a moment it was just him and me. The echo of who we used to be clawing its way to the surface. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, his voice rough when he whispered, "I don't deserve you." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "You don't." And yet I didn't move. I didn't push him away. Because as much as I wanted to hate him, as much as I wanted to escape, the truth was that every time he touched me, The world made sense again, even if it was the wrong kind of sense. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet again, he came to me. Not as the Mafia boss, not as the man the world feared, but as Damien, the boy I once loved. His eyes tired, his voice soft. "There's something you need to know," he said, sitting beside me on the edge of the bed. "The Rossettis aren't done. They want you now." "Me?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Why?" "Because they think you're my weakness," he said, his jaw tightening. And they're right. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked somewhere in the distance, steady and cruel. And I realized that whatever happened next, we were already past the point of saving. Finally, he stood, his hand brushing mine as he said, "There's only one way to keep you safe, Lena." I looked up at him, fear clawing at my throat. "What way?" His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady, resolute. "You stay with me. You become mine. Completely. No more running. No more pretending you don't belong in this world." I stared at him, unable to tell whether it was a promise or a sentence. "That's not protection," I whispered. "That's captivity." He smiled faintly, but there was no cruelty in it this time, only something that looked like sorrow. "Maybe," he said, "but it's the only bargain the devil knows how to make." And as he turned to leave, the truth settled in my chest like a weight I'd never lift. I wasn't a hostage anymore. I was a choice. A dangerous, impossible, irrevocable choice. There are nights that feel like confessions, nights where silence becomes a kind of language, and every breath carries the weight of something you're too afraid to say. And since the moment Damien told me that I was his weakness, those nights became endless, stretching long and heavy, filled with the ache of what we were and the terror of what we were becoming. The world outside his mansion felt distant now, like a dream I had once lived in another life. A quieter one with cheap coffee and the hum of neon lights, and yet it had all begun to fade, replaced by the rhythm of his world. A rhythm built on danger and control, on shadows that moved through corridors and whispered promises that sounded like threats. I had started to understand the pattern of his life, the way power pulsed through every wall, the way he commanded loyalty not with words but with presence, the way people looked at him as if he were both king and executioner. And I wondered if they saw the same thing I did. Not just the monster, but the man drowning beneath his own armor. He kept his distance for a few days after that night, the night of our bargain, as if giving me space might somehow erase the words he had spoken. But distance in that house was an illusion. Every step I took echoed in his silence. Every thought of escape circled back to him like gravity. And though I told myself I wanted freedom, I began to realize I wouldn't even know what to do with it anymore. One morning, I found him in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the fountain, his back to me, his posture rigid, his hands clasped loosely as if he were trying to remember how to pray. The sun had barely risen, and the air still carried the cool scent of dew and earth. But there was something about the moment that felt fragile, sacred almost, like watching a wolf forget it had teeth. "You shouldn't be up so early," I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper against the wind. He turned his head slightly, not surprised to see me, his eyes half-shadowed. "Sleep doesn't come easily anymore," he said. "Too many ghosts in the dark." I sat beside him, not too close, but close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from him, the subtle tremor in the air that always came when he was near. "Does it ever stop?" I asked. "The ghosts?" He smiled faintly without humor. "No. You just learn to live with them. You feed them and they stop screaming." There was a sadness in the way he said it that made my chest tighten, a quiet exhaustion that slipped through his usual armor of composure. For a moment I thought about reaching for his hand, but I didn't. because I didn't know if the comfort I wanted to offer would be a kindness or a cruelty. "Tell me about the Rossettis," I said instead, because I was tired of living among questions. He hesitated, the line of his jaw tightening. "They were once allies," he said finally, his tone distant, practiced. "We built empires side by side until greed made enemies of us. They wanted control. I wanted peace. But in this world, peace is a weakness someone always exploits." "And now?" I asked. "Now," he said, his voice hardening. "They're trying to erase me." The words were simple, but the way he said them carried centuries of blood and betrayal. I looked at him, at the man I had loved and lost and found again in the ashes of everything I thought was true. And for the first time I understood that there was no future waiting for us outside, this war. That his life and mine were both tethered to a fire that would burn until there was nothing left to save. Later that day, I went exploring through the house again, trying to find some corner that didn't smell of fear or memory. I ended up in a small room I hadn't seen before, a room lined with photographs and old books, softer somehow, lived in, almost human. On the desk was a picture in a silver frame, a young boy, dark-haired and smiling, sitting beside a man whose eyes mirrored his. The resemblance was unmistakable. "His father," a voice said behind me, and I turned sharply to see Matteo, Damien's right-hand man, standing in the doorway. I nodded slowly. "He looks happy?" Matteo's expression shifted, something between fondness and regret. He was. Before the world showed him what it does to good men. The silence between us felt heavy with unspoken things. "Do you ever think he could be that person again?" I asked quietly. Matteo sighed, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "I think he wants to be, but I don't know if wanting is enough. The kind of life he leads, it doesn't let you come back." His words lingered long after he left, and as I stood there staring at the photograph, I realized that I wasn't just trapped in Damien's house. I was trapped in the story of his ruin. That night, the storm came. Not just outside, though the rain lashed against the windows like fury itself, but inside the house too. I heard shouting again, gunfire in the distance, men rushing through the halls. I ran to the balcony and saw cars pulling into the drive, headlights cutting through the darkness, flashes of movement that looked like chaos spilling into order. Then I saw him, Damien, stepping out into the rain without hesitation, his suit already soaked, his expression calm, but lethal. He barked an order I couldn't hear, drew his gun, and disappeared into the night. I waited by the window for what felt like hours, my heart thundering with every crack of thunder, every shot in the distance. I wanted to run, to hide, to do something, but all I could do was stand there and pray. Not to God, because I'd stopped believing in divine mercy long ago, but to whatever cruel universe had brought him back to me, asking it not to take him away again. When he finally returned, his hands were stained red, his face streaked with rain and blood that wasn't his eyes wild in a way that made my breath catch. He looked at me. Just looked. And in that one gaze I saw everything. The exhaustion, the violence, the desperation, and beneath it all, the same broken tenderness that had once made me fall in love with him. He didn't speak. He just crossed the room, grabbed me by the waist, and pulled me against him, his mouth finding mine in a kiss that was all fire and grief and hunger. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't kind. It was a confession without words, a plea, a punishment, a promise. When he finally pulled away, his voice was rough, his forehead pressed against mine. "They're dead," he said. "All of them. But it's not over. It's never over." I looked at him, at the blood on his hands, and whispered, "What will it take for it to end?" He smiled, the kind of smile that breaks your heart because it doesn't reach his eyes. Everything, he said softly. It will take everything. That night, when he finally fell asleep beside me, his arm heavy across my waist, his breathing uneven, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the storm still raging outside. I thought about the boy he had been, the man he had become, and the version of myself that I no longer recognized. Because somewhere between love and survival, I had changed too. I had stopped being the girl who wanted to save him and become the woman who would burn with him if it meant we could stand in the same fire. And maybe that's what love really is when it's born from ashes. Not the light that saves you, but the flame that consumes you both. There comes a point in every story where you stop pretending that the ending can still be rewritten, where the weight of everything that has happened presses so heavily against your chest that every breath feels like an act of defiance. And I think that's where I was now, standing at the edge of something I couldn't name, watching the empire Damien built begin to fracture beneath the pressure of too much blood, too many secrets, and the unrelenting truth that no one can outrun what they've become. The days after the storm passed in a haze of whispers and movement, the house no longer quiet but alive with the low hum of panic. Men came and went in pairs now, their eyes sharp, their hands always near their guns, their words laced with tension. I saw it in the way Matteo spoke in low tones to Damien behind closed doors, in the way doors that were once left open now slammed shut, in the way Damien's voice, once calm, controlled, cold, now carried the edge of something volatile, like a man who had realized that control was a fragile illusion he'd been pretending to hold for far too long. I tried to talk to him. I tried to reach through the layers of silence and pride and guilt, but he was slipping, and no matter how close I stood, he always felt a step away, unreachable, untouchable, trapped inside the walls he built to keep the world out and his ghosts in. One evening I found him in his office, staring out the window at the gardens below, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his reflection fractured by the glass. The light caught the faint scar along his jaw, the one I'd never noticed before. And for a moment, I saw not the man everyone feared, but the boy I'd once kissed under the church steps, the one who dreamed of leaving this city behind. Something's wrong, I said softly, because I'd learned to recognize the stillness before chaos, the kind that lived in his shoulders and the corners of his mouth. He didn't look at me. There's always something wrong, he said, his tone detached, almost bitter. This is different, I insisted. You haven't slept. You've barely eaten. Whatever you're carrying, it's going to destroy you if you don't let someone in. He turned then, slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and the intensity in them was so sharp it stole my breath. Let someone in? He repeated, his voice low, rough, almost mocking. The last time I let someone in, they buried a knife between my ribs and smiled while they twisted it. That's how this world works, Lena. You trust, you die, you love, you bleed. And what about me? I whispered. Do I bleed too? He hesitated, his jaw tightening, and for a heartbeat I thought he might tell me the truth. That he might admit that yes, I was bleeding too. That I had been from the moment he came back into my life. But instead he just looked away. I can't protect you anymore, he said finally, and though the words were quiet, they hit harder than any gunshot. What do you mean you can't protect me? I demanded, moving closer. What happened? He exhaled, the sound heavy, weary. The Rossettis aren't acting alone anymore, he said. They've joined forces with someone inside my ranks. I don't know who yet. But they've been bleeding me dry from the inside. Money, contacts, shipments. Everything I built is crumbling, piece by piece. So fight back, I said. You always fight back. His smile was thin, empty. You don't fight ghosts, Lena. You just wait for them to come collect what's theirs. I wanted to shake him, to scream at him, to remind him that he was the man who once ruled the city with nothing but willpower and rage. But the look in his eyes silenced me. It wasn't defeat. Not entirely. But something worse. Resignation. That night I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, heavy, too full of the things we weren't saying. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, though the sky outside was clear. I got up, restless, pacing the hallways that had once seemed endless, but now felt like the ribs of a dying beast. It was just past midnight when I heard it. The crash of glass, the sharp echo of gunfire, and then the sound of shouting. My blood turned to ice. I ran toward the noise, down the stairs, through the main corridor, until I saw Matteo lying on the floor, blood spreading beneath him like ink. "Matteo!" I cried, dropping beside him, but his eyes were already glassy, his mouth struggling to form words. "Inside man," he rasped. "It's someone close. Too close." And then his head fell to the side, and the silence that followed was deafening. The door to the study burst open a second later, and Damien came storming out, gun in hand, his face pale but his expression pure fury. "Get back!" he barked, grabbing my wrist. "What's happening?" I demanded, my heart pounding. "Betrayal," he said, his voice low, clipped, cold. "One of my own men opened the gates. They're inside." I froze. "Who?" "I don't know," he said, pulling me behind him, "but I'll find out before I kill them." The next moments blurred together. Footsteps, shouts, the smell of smoke. The house that had always felt too big suddenly seemed to close in around us, every hallway a trap, every shadow a threat. Damien moved like he had been born for this, steady, silent, deadly, his hand gripping mine as we slipped through the corridors. We reached the back of the house just as another explosion rattled the walls, sending a rain of plaster and dust down from the ceiling. He turned to me then, his face streaked with ash, his breath coming fast. "You need to go," he said, shoving a key into my hand. "There's a car in the garage. Take it. Drive north. Don't stop until you're out of the city." I shook my head, refusing to take it. "No, I'm not leaving you." He grabbed my shoulders, his eyes fierce. "Lena, listen to me. If they get their hands on you, they'll use you to end me. You don't understand how dangerous they are." "Then let them end you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I can't keep watching you die piece by piece." He smiled then, a small, broken smile that shattered me. "You think I'd ever let them have that satisfaction?" A gunshot rang out, sharp and close, and Damien's expression changed. Surprise, pain, disbelief. He staggered back, a dark bloom spreading across his shirt. "Damien!" I screamed, catching him as he fell, my hands already slick with his blood. He tried to speak, but the words came out as a whisper, a ghost of sound. "It was someone close," he said. "Too close." I looked up then, my heart stopping, and saw the shadow in the doorway. It was Luca, one of his most trusted men, the one who had served him for years, who had been by his side through every rise and fall. "You shouldn't have come back, boss," Luca said, his gun still raised, his expression a mix of regret and resolve. "You forgot what mercy costs in this business." I moved without thinking, placing myself between them, my body shaking but my voice steady. "Put the gun down, Luca." He hesitated, his gaze flicking to me. "He made his choice, Lena. Don't make me make yours too." Damien's hand found mine, weak but insistent. "Go," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please." But I couldn't move. I wouldn't. Because no matter how much blood he had spilled, no matter how many sins he carried, he was still Damien. My first love, my only love, my ruin and my home. And I wasn't going to let him fall alone. Luca's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was the only thing that followed. There are moments when time seems to split apart, when sound becomes silence and movement turns to stillness, and all that exists is the pulse of your own heartbeat echoing against the walls of a world that no longer feels real. And that was what it felt like when the gun went off. A single deafening sound that shattered the fragile line between love and loss, leaving only the terrible stillness that follows destruction. I didn't even know who had been hit at first, because everything blurred together. The smoke, the shouting, the sharp smell of gunpowder mingling with blood and rain. But then Damien's body jerked against mine, his breath catching in a way that made the air itself stop, and I knew before I looked that it was him. His eyes, those eyes that had once held the whole world inside them, went glassy for a moment, then found mine again with a focus so raw it broke something inside me. "Lena," he whispered, his voice cracking like the sound of a flame sputtering before it dies. I held him, my hands pressed against the wound that kept spilling his life through my fingers, my breath coming in ragged sobs that felt more like prayers than air. But it was useless. I knew it even as I screamed his name. The blood wouldn't stop. The light in his eyes flickered and dimmed, and behind us, Luca was still standing there, gun lowered, his expression hollow. "Damien," I said again, though my voice was barely a whisper now. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." He smiled faintly, that small, heartbreaking curve of his lips that always came before he said something I wasn't ready to hear. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said quietly. "You should have run when I told you to." "I wasn't going to leave you," I said, shaking my head, my tears falling onto his face. "Not again, not ever." A shudder passed through him, his fingers tightening around mine. "You always were stubborn," he murmured, and even now, dying in my arms, he sounded almost amused, almost like the boy I had met all those years ago, when the world was still soft. Behind us, Luca's voice broke through the haze, low and trembling. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. "He was already falling apart. I just wanted to end it before they did." I looked up at him, fury burning so hot it felt like I was on fire. "You killed him," I said. "You killed the man who would have died for you." "He was already dead," Luca whispered, his voice cracking. "You just didn't see it yet." I wanted to kill him then. I wanted to grab the gun and end him the way he had ended Damien. But Damien's hand found my wrist, his grip weak but insistent. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't become me." And that was what stopped me. Not the weakness in his voice, but the strength of it. The last flicker of goodness still alive inside a man who had done so many terrible things. I dropped the gun and buried my face against his chest, feeling the slow, uneven rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, knowing I was counting down the seconds I had left with him. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. The rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the shattered windows, washing the blood across the marble floor into rivers of red that glistened under the dying light. He reached up, his fingers brushing my cheek one last time. "Promise me something," he whispered. "Anything," I said, though my throat was tight and the word barely made it out. "When it's over," he said, his voice faint, "you walk away. You don't look back. You live, Lena. You live like I never could." And I wanted to promise, I wanted to tell him yes, but the word got lost somewhere between the pain and the disbelief. Because how do you promise life to the person who is your life? Then his hand slipped from my face, fell limp against the floor, and in that moment, something inside me cracked open, a soundless breaking that felt worse than death itself, because I knew then that he was gone, that the boy I loved, the man I tried to save, the monster I could never stop forgiving, had finally found the peace he'd been chasing through every wrong choice, every sin, every violent night. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there in the ruins of his empire, the rain soaking through my clothes, the smell of blood heavy in the air. Men came and went around me, shouting orders, clearing bodies, trying to salvage what was left. But I didn't see them. All I saw was him, the rise and fall that defined his life, the man who had built a kingdom out of fear and then burned it down for love. Eventually, they took his body away, and I followed in silence, numb, my fingers still stained red, my heart still refusing to understand that it was over. Matteo was gone, Luca had vanished, and the mansion that once stood as a monument to Damien's power was nothing more than a tomb now. A house haunted by what it had cost to hold the world in your hands. In the days that followed, I did what I promised him I would, or at least I tried. I left the city. I drove north until the skyline disappeared behind me, until the roads turned to dirt and the world felt quiet again. I found a small town by the coast, a place where no one knew my name, where the sound of waves could almost drown out the memories. But peace, I've learned, is not the absence of pain. It's the slow, unbearable act of carrying it until it becomes part of you, until the hurt and the love blur into one thing you can no longer separate. Sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night, reaching for him, expecting to find his warmth beside me. And for a moment, in the half-light between dream and waking, I almost do. I almost hear his voice, low and steady, whispering my name the way he used to when he thought I was asleep. I still wear the locket he once gave me, the one I found in that box on the night he returned. And, inside it, I've placed a photo of us from before the world fell apart. Me laughing, him looking at me like I was the only thing that made sense. The silver has tarnished now, the edges worn smooth, but I can't bring myself to take it off, because it's all I have left of him that isn't tainted by blood. They say love and hate are twins, that both are born from the same fire, but I think they're wrong. I think love, the real kind, the kind that destroys and redeems in the same breath, is closer to grief. Because love, like grief, doesn't end. It just changes shape. It just keeps finding you in the quiet, in the rain, in the small, aching spaces between what was and what will never be again. And maybe that's what he meant when he told me to live. Not to forget him, not to erase the pain, but to carry it forward. To let it remind me that even in the darkest places, even in the ruins, something beautiful once existed, something worth remembering. So I live. Not for me, not even for him, but for the moments we never got, the life that could have been, the peace he never found, the love that refused to die even after everything else did. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees just before a storm, I swear I can hear his voice in it, soft and low, saying my name the way only he ever could. And in that sound, I find both my ending and my beginning. Because some loves don't fade. They burn, quietly, eternally, in the ashes we leave behind.